session's headline is "Have the Lambs Finally Broken Their Silence? People Fury." Now, discussing anything in India is monumentally complex, and this particular issue, this issue of a new awakening, this issue of a new noise in the country, a new series of protests, or to use Naipaul's famous phrase from 1990, a million mutinies now, the sound of a million mutinies now. I mean, to decide for this is truly difficult. Is this noise, or is this the sound of a great civilization beginning to make its way into a new kind of future? I'm of the belief that this is actually, no matter how clamorous and chaotic it sounds, this is actually a very salutary phase in the story of India. All these protest movements that we see across the country, all the protest noises that we see across the country are, in a sense, an attempt to in a sense, right-size the story of India. And the story of India itself, I will say, has fundamentally got a plinth that allows this to happen. So, and is it corrosive or is it beneficial? I'll say it's beneficial, whatever is happening. Though because we are so up close against it, we are a little traumatized by the noise and the sheer strife that we see around us. The question here, if you look at the title of the session as it's been framed, is who are the lambs? That itself becomes a huge question. Nobody in this hall can call themselves a lamb, I'll tell you that. Some of us might be a few good shepherds, many of us would be big bad wolves, but I don't think there are any lambs here. And to define the lamb itself is a challenge in a country that has so many class structures. Who is a lamb? Is the guy who eats rats for a living in Bihar a lamb? Is the manual scavenger in Uttar Pradesh a lamb? Is the middle class clerk a lamb? Who really is the lamb who has now begun to speak up? I have my views on that, but I have a fantastic panel of colleagues here, and I'm going to actually ask them to speak up first and get a little bit of insight into how they see the great change, the great flux that we're living through. How do they read it? I'm actually going to go to Harsh first. Harsh is a friend. He's a great social warrior. And I'm going to ask him to try and define for us in some way, before he does anything else, who in India today is the lamb? Who do we call the lamb? And is the lamb beginning to speak up and bleat? Harsh.
I think that in India,
मेरे को जो sense है, मैं informally कह रहा हूँ, मतलब मैं am not.
As you're saying, highly unequal society. Large parts of India suffer injustice of some kind, discrimination of some kind. So, when you're saying we are the 99%, there is a 99% in one way or the other, which is the lamb. But within them, those who are most marginalized by caste, by gender, the people who, the Musahars who eat rats and teach their children how to sleep hungry. Somehow the formal electoral system and the way it works, formal politics, the formal institutions of democracy have not been able to throw up the concerns of the most marginalized within the weakest among the lambs, if you'd like it. And therefore, I think that recognizing social dissent movements as being central to the health of an Indian, of democracy. I mean, we normally think of democracy, characterized by universal adult franchise and the separation of powers between the executive and the judiciary and the parliament, etc. I think the spaces for social dissent and how well it is used probably is most central to the health of a democracy. And one or two things that I'd like to add to it. The idea that this is something new that is happening today, I think ignores the fact that if you look back over the last, if I ask in the audience for the poor, for the most disadvantaged in India, what are the most significant things that have happened in terms of public policy? So you list the NREGA, the RTI, maybe the food bill, you may be talking about a better framework on violence against women. environmental laws, the land acquisition issues. If you really think hard, most or almost all of these have come through small social dissent movements rather than through the formal electoral process. And I think that's been part of how democracy has functioned in India, and that is why the lambs and the weakest among the lambs have had some voice. I think the leadership of this country has still not come to terms with it, and because we have a large youthful population, more than half the population is below 25 years, and there is a certain kind of middle class, city-based assertion around corruption and violence against women recently. The executive tried to respond to them pretty much, and the political class in general, how they have tended to deal with social dissent in the past, and it didn't work.
No, since Harsh, we are talking about popular movements as they've been framed, the lambs speaking out, and a structure in place which, according to you, is highly calcified. It's calcified in a way that's become unresponsive.
Right.
But am I right in understanding that what you're saying is that social dissent movements are crucial catalysts, but are not in any way a replacement of the representational democratic system?
Absolutely not. But I think that the representational democratic system has to understand and deal more respectfully with social dissent movements. You know, there's a story told about Roosevelt after the Great Depression. America was in shambles. And he had this long meeting with the trade unions where they came up with a set of what needed to be done. And what he told them at the end is, now that we've decided what needs to be done, now it's your job to go out there and make sure that I do it. And I think that that understanding of how dissent, which you don't agree with, is actually constructive. I think our leadership, the Prime Minister, for instance, doesn't say very much, but one of the few things after the Anna movement had happened, one of the things that he said was that it's not the business of people to make laws, it is Parliament which makes laws. And I think that he was right in only the most narrow technical sense. Where have labor laws come? It's come because of labor movements. Where have laws for gender justice come? It's come because of women's struggles over the years. So I think that we need to recognize the legitimate role of people's assertion in a democracy, but I think that people's movements also need to be much more respectful of the role of the formal political institutions as well.
I'm actually, we already lost one of our panelists. This is what happens when you turn your back in India. You lose half your team. I'll take it to you, Shazia, straight away, because you had a very curious career graph. You were in media, in mainline media. You moved away and became part of a social dissent movement to begin with, a political and social dissent movement. And now you're slowly segueing yourself into mainline politics. Just tell us a little bit about this journey of yours and what have the learnings been from this journey, going from being a media person and critiquing politics and the system to then becoming a social activist on the street. Shazia was very closely involved with the Anna Hazare movement and now is with Arvind Kejriwal's movement. And then the shift to the idea of formal politics, which you had just been critiquing most vociferously before the shift came to formal politics itself. What has the journey been? More importantly, what have the learnings been from this entire movement, the shifting career graph?
Well, thank you so much, Tarun. The learnings have been huge, really. And when we look at this topic, when lambs break their silence, I think they're just about beginning to. And it's important to do so because that's the only way you can ward off the wolves or tell them off to reach an inflection point, a tipping point. That moment of critical mass where people kind of feel the stirring of consciousness, which is what we saw in the Anna Hazare movement. Lots of professionals, people who were apathetic, a lot of members of the middle class came out on the streets. Now, this was something new. When we saw the Mandal agitation, it was of a different kind. It was caste-based, there was violence. So it was a new kind of politics that we were attempting to do. I was in Star News, and I thought I was an anchor with a prominent news channel. And I thought I understood enough about news and current affairs. I read the regular papers. I come from a family of journalists. But the understanding that I have of 2 years, starting from Anna Hazare movement till now with Aam Aadmi Party, which I represent here and as a member of AAP, I think in these 2 years what I've learned about India and my country and the issues people face is far more concrete and solid than I had as a journalist. And I think it's important sometimes to change the state-citizen equation, and both the movements that I've been a part of course, that doesn't mean that I was not part of the Bhavri Devi, which is how it started that when I was in college, and the Mandal agitation later on, but only as a student. What I've learned essentially is that to change the equation, the state-citizen equation, was really the leitmotif of both the movements. And for the first time in these two movements, which were different from Mandal agitation or the Gujjar agitation, or good to have you back, Suhasini. We kind of missed you. So it is important to know that these were the only movements, that the ones that I participated every day of the time when they were there, that there was this pan-citizen identity being created instead of this very Dalit versus Swaran, Muslim versus Hindu, Pasemanda and upper class Muslims. So for the first time, there was people were clamoring for civic engagement. Not just that, for the first time we were discussing how politics is done. We were discussing CBI, we were discussing inclusion of bureaucrats, A, B, C in Lokpal, and we didn't even know of the word Lokpal and Lokayuk 2 years back. So somewhere I think the takeaway has been for me and for others, and the learning is a civic engagement. For people to do direct politics, not just through practicing the electoral franchise, once in 5 years of their midterm polls, maybe once in thrice, but to be there, to see how policies are being made, to affect them, to go out on the streets and ask for better laws maybe, to somewhere impact the legislation. And for the parliament to actually truly reflect the will of the people, that is the mandate of the parliament to start with. Because there is a huge disconnect with the way the ruling elite is and the rest of them, and I'll call all of them lambs here in my context, I think it's important for a meeting ground to be, obviously laws will be made in parliament, which is why we realized that no matter how much we clamored for and how many figures we showed on the streets, it was important to get into the political fray, which is exactly what we did.
You know, I couldn't agree more about the awareness bit, but just a thought which is worth considering, that much as earlier movements had certain identities, whether they were caste or community, in a sense, even this particular movement, the Lokpal Bill movement, was fundamentally a class movement. It was a middle class movement. And I remember one of the difficulties I had with it when Annaji first started off, and I have respect for him, he's a friend of mine. I didn't agree entirely with everything that the movement represented. But I think one of the problems one could have had with it was that it left out a vast cadre of what we could call lambs. It left out Dalits, it left out tribals, it left out Muslims, I would say, other disenfranchised communities in many ways. So in a sense, it's not again a critique, I'm just trying to, again, to invoke the fundamental complexity of any process you undertake. The second thing, and I'm going to ask you to speak a little about it, Suhasini, is that there is, in a democracy, a primary legitimacy to the elected representative. I say this for myself, not just for all of you, and I remind this to myself almost every day of my life, that there is a kind of arrogance in any of us assuming that we have a greater legitimacy in a democratic landscape than an elected representative. You know, I mean, anybody who in India actually contests an election and has 500,000 or 1 million people vote him into power has a legitimacy that we can't just assume. There is a legitimacy there. So our modes of criticism have to always account for that. You know, now the question I want to ask you was one to do with that very often do we in media today, and I include myself in that, acquire a kind of moral hauteur which is a little unfair, which may be a little arrogant and misplaced. And is there a problem about ordering our priorities today? You know, fundamentally when I look at media, I came into journalism 30 years ago, I thought the chief function of a media organization was to order public priority. Why should a newspaper be important or a television channel be important in our lives? I think what it does fundamentally is it orders priorities of public policy for the state. That's what it does. So when you make page one or when you declare your news on your main show in the evening, what you're saying is, because I put this at number one, this is what the state should be focusing on, 1, 2, 3, 4. And the state therefore becomes responsible to what we imagine should be its priorities. Has that altered in some kind of deleterious way in the last few years? Is all that we hear good, or is a lot of it noise that needs to be discounted?
There's so many issues in there, Tarun. Firstly, on behalf of the media industry, if you like, it's always so difficult to speak on behalf of an entire industry that is so disparate. We are all such different characters in there. I want to start with one basic premise, that most of us came into this profession, and I know you did too, with the idea that media is not just a profession, and it's certainly not a business. It is essentially a public service. What's happened over decades, I think, is that this idea of public service has become much more of catering to the people, to finding out what they want to watch or want to read, and working with that as some kind of a thing. I have a very funny statistic, which is that essentially in the US, for example, with CNN, the profitability of television has essentially become, if you like, in terms of moral values, its downfall. I say this because when the Gulf War happened, suddenly millions of viewers around the world were switching on television and watching the Gulf War because it was possible to see it live. And others who own television businesses were suddenly looking at this television channel and going, aha, it can be profitable. There is a bottom line. And ever since then, in fact, the way television has worked, the way coverage of events have worked, has actually worked in a sort of, if you like, that progression. The progression has been much more towards that bottom line and away from what was originally public service. Now, I'm taking that American example, but of course, in India, our business is a lot younger. And what I'm hoping is that we're, in fact, not going to follow that model at all and move towards something else. The second part of what you said is legitimacy. It's taken on a new, it's taken on a new meaning, because you say 500,000, you say 1 million, you know, every member of parliament represents that many. And yet I can tell you that in a television camera, if I was to put a camera into this room, I could focus on these seats over here that are empty and tell you nobody came to the Mind Summit. Or I could look at some of the faces here and say, all the most powerful people were at the Mind Summit. I'm just trying to say that the television business has to now start being contextualized. Everything you see has to be put into a context. And while Shazia has been part of a very, very visible movement, did we put a context to it when it was 24 hours coverage of minute by minute of the juice that was drunk, of the BP of Anna Hazare, or you know, and not just him, but of the rest, or what we see today, which is when Arvind Kejriwal is on his 14th day of a fast, and maybe, you know, a 30-second mention during prime time. I'm just putting these issues out there because I've been saying to Tarun, as an anchor, as a media person, I sometimes think it's not necessary to have an opinion. But it's necessary to be able to take a step back and look at some of these issues. I think there is a larger context in the world. Let's remember that the anti-corruption movement also broke out at the same time as the Arab Spring. There was the Occupy Wall Street movement. What many of us didn't look at was the economic angle to these movements. That the anger that you saw on the street, much of it was against dictatorial regimes in parts of the world, but essentially there was one common thread. And it was across all these movements, and that was of the anger over inflation and unemployment, which I think, with the possible exception of Libya, has been a running thread in all the economies that faced it. And I think we didn't give that enough credit. It was all about anger against the establishment, no matter where they were. And finally, I think what has changed, and again, when you say legitimacy, I completely agree that you cannot get away from the fact that the parliamentary system has delivered. It might not have delivered to its optimal, but in a country like ours, I almost felt proud of the kind of debates I saw at the time inside Parliament. But I think that what has emerged is that governments can no longer work on the idea that they are only, what is the word, responsible and accountable to those 500,000, 1 million people at the time of elections. That they need to be able to reach out, that they need to be able to communicate that these new mediums, that the emerging media as it's known, is not something to be laughed off and said, you know, these people don't count. They don't go out to vote. I think that need to communicate and to reach out to them was felt. And if people felt let down, it was because the government wasn't just speaking over their head, they were almost mocking them in some of those days. Now, I know these are a lot of disparate thoughts, but really, I think what we saw in the last year of these movements, of this anger of the lambs, if you like, was a coming together of all these ideas. And I think we ignore that, in a sense, at our peril. And we also have to remember that the media can only to one extent either magnify or shrink the size of this anger. I think, of course, you know, I did a quick check yesterday, and it turns out that there are 430 news channels now with licenses, and 150 more are hoping to get their license before the next election. So this platform and its ability to amplify is very, very, very large. But even so, it should not be over-amplified. And I'll leave you with that last figure, really, which is that, that the media, in a sense, when we talk about the media, we're thinking news media. And in fact, 90% of it, in fact, 95% of it, most of the time is entertainment. 5.5% of the viewership actually represents the news. 0.5% of that represents the English news. So when it comes down to one English channel and, you know, how amplified we make it, and we talk about one English channel changing the way the country is thinking, we have to remember that it's one fraction of that 0.5% of that, you know, viewing public that is actually watching mostly entertainment. So, so we need to not just contextualize the pictures we're seeing on TV. I think we need to also contextualize just how much of an impact we're having. And I totally agree with you, Tarun. Eventually, none of this will matter come May 2014 or when the next elections are held, and the people have their say.
Before you run away to Master Pakistan, which I know you have to do now, I want you to just try and disentangle two thoughts. So there are movements on the ground, and anybody who's been in journalism from 5 to 50 years knows there are, at any given time in India, incredible movements going on the ground with fantastic people's warriors fighting very difficult battles. Forest, land, livelihood, human rights, what's happening every day. And then there is the media, which picks a few, which we often term in newsrooms as sexy stories or sexy protests, and we amplify them. In your opinion, does it fundamentally alter the potency of these struggles, the media's picking or choosing of what they will play with and what they will not play with? I mean, Shazia and the Anna Hazare movement are a classic example. Given saturation coverage once, dropped another time. Baba Ramdev went through that particular cycle, saturation coverage, dropped. I'm asking something deeper. Does it fundamentally, in your opinion, as a seasoned newscaster, does it impact the potency of these movements? What has your experience been?
I think my own experience is very simply that a movement is potent or not, or impotent or not potent on the basis of its own strengths. I think the media at some point can play a role in awareness. It can play a role in an amplification, if you like. But the fact is, movements that stay despite people actually covering them or not covering them. Two examples in the last year was that march that came from Madhya Pradesh to Delhi. Complete
the
Ekta Parishad March.
Yeah.
And the other has been very recently the farmers in Delhi.
But you know,
these are both movements that were not covered on television.
And the Ekta Parishad was not covered at all, if you remember.
Absolutely. And both have been extremely successful in terms of having their demands understood and actually getting into engagements with the government at some level. I mean, I know Harsh and Shazia know much more about the effectiveness of these movements, but I do think that, that we over-amplify what the media can do. I think what we need to look to the media much more to do, as I said, is to give the context to a lot of these movements and to not be cynical about this.
So what's keeping the media from doing that, in your opinion?
To be really honest, Tarun, and I'm sure you've seen it much more than I have, I think the news palette every day is a changing thing. It's a dynamic thing. I don't believe that there are always these news agendas at work, and I'm just a reporter, so I'm not somebody who's making that decision. But I I can tell you from the perspective of someone who covers international news and foreign policy, because we are also part of the lambs, by the way. I'm told again and again, nobody in this country cares about foreign policy. Nobody in this country cares about our neighbors. Why do you bother covering all these, you know, Sri Lanka and Bangladesh and Pakistan when nobody here cares about them? So in a sense, they are also marginalized subjects. And the reason I think we do them is it's always going to be a toss-up between a variety of things that are available. But as I said, I think the danger has become this idea that because we can go live from something, then we can do this saturation coverage. And the answer is always going to be let more and more voices prevail, not this idea that we should dictate what the news agenda is or what people should watch, but let more and more ideas prevail, which is why I'm very happy that there are 500 news channels coming up.
Asim, before I come to you, I'm going to actually put a poser to Harsh. Harsh, would you say that fundamentally India's elite, which means all of us sitting here, remains a very self-serving elite? Its concerns are dominantly, even when they're concerns about right-sizing things and getting ethics and morality into systems or getting progressive, you know, legislations passed, it's fundamentally always looking through its own narrow, you know, telescope of its own interests. And I bring back the Anna Hazare movement in this case again by saying it may have electrified people because it talked about something that concerned them. And what you wanted to tell a lot of the middle class people who were infuriated at the sorry state of affairs in India was that there was actually a much, much sorrier state of affairs which they never focused on. There was tribal degradation, there was the ending of tribal lands and lives, there's been Muslim persecutions which we have documented to a great extent. There's been the Dalit story where you have manual scavenging even today, even despite this political revolution that has swept India in the last 60 years. So somewhere, would you say that in a sense we remain, the elite in India remains a very self-serving elite, and that is in fact at the heart of the Indian crisis? Because the elite that founded the idea of India was actually not a self-serving elite. Because all the documents they created, all the statutes they wrote, the constitution that they created, its primary target was the upliftment of the oppressed and the poor.
I couldn't agree with you more. You know, if I have to summarize in one line what I think is the central problem of India today, it is inequality combined with indifference. I think that our cultural comfort level with inequality is spectacular at this point of our history. I feel that, you know, whether inequality has increased over the last 50, 60 years or reduced, we can debate. But whether the moral acceptability of this inequality, you know, somebody has calculated that the number of people who have died of avoidable causes because of hunger and malnutrition and disease, etc., is about 200 million people. You know, that should be a scandal of, the fact that it is not a scandal is because we have accepted poverty as being something that is just normal and acceptable. Both Mr. Chidambaram and Montek Ahluwalia were asked how long is poverty going to continue in this country. Both of them in separate occasions have said it will go on till 2040, which means that every poor person today, we are saying you don't even have the prospect or the possibility of a new or better life, and that's how that is acceptable. If I was coming from another planet and I wanted to understand what India was like, and I watched Indian television or I watched films, you would imagine that there are no poor people in India today. I mean, I really describe this as the exile of the poor from our conscience and our consciousness. I think that, you know, even from the time I grew up, at least, you know, your mother used to tell you that don't waste food, there are hungry people outside, hungry children outside. There was a certain engagement. You dressed, I got my first set of new clothes when I was 8 years old. You lived a little more responsibly, a little more thriftily, respectful of people who had less. Today, there's a sense of complete entitlement, and I think that, you know, the Indian middle class today combines, you know, some of the values of the caste system, the Indian caste system, the British class system, and then this new American-led idea of give up the socialist guilt of the past, let us lead the good life. And I think that the levels of indifference, you know, when I work with homeless children, for instance, and it often strikes me that, you know, the physical distance when I put my own child to bed on a cold winter night, it's 0 degrees, 1 degree temperatures, and she's, you know, had every kind of comfort, protection, etc. It doesn't worry me that 1 kilometer distant, just 1 kilometer distance, is another child exactly her age, sleeping under the open sky. She's found her food in the rubbish heap. She's going to be, you know, sexually abused through the night. She'll never see the inside of a school. She'll pick rags and somehow survive. The fact that it doesn't worry us. And one more example, just to illustrate this, was really the Right to Education bill made a very modest requirement that in elite schools, in the entry-level school class, you will have 25% children from disadvantaged backgrounds. What happened? Instead of welcoming this, all the elite schools collected huge sums of money, employed the battery of the best lawyers in this country to oppose this provision in the Supreme Court. And the reasons they gave were really interesting. They said that, you know, we're really worried about the disadvantaged child. That child will not be able to adjust. So let's open schools, you know, in the basti somewhere and so on. Even worse, they said merit will suffer. You know, as if we in this room are here because of our merit. None of us are in this room because of our merit, because if 1 billion people in this country had exactly the same life chances that you and I have had, I wouldn't be here, Tarun wouldn't be here, and most of you would not be here. And I think that at least recognize that we are not here because we are the best, we are here because we've had life chances which you know, 80%, 70% of our people can never even dream of. I think that the sense of entitlement of privilege and the indifference, you know, somebody called Elie Wiesel has said somewhere that the opposite of love is not hate, the opposite of love is indifference. I think in India, we are living through a phase of spectacular indifference.
So you and I agree that nobody in this hall is a lamb, actually.
Yeah.
The lambs are somewhere out there.
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, I'm going to, Shahji, come back to you with something that Harsh has opened up, but let's get Asim into this conversation. Asim, why don't you tell us a little bit about your own sort of very famous skirmish with the state, and what are the lessons it's left you with in terms of understanding the nature of India and your work and where you stand with it?
तो मुझे लगता है कि इस पूरी स्टोरी में एक बात और ध्यान रखने की है कि हम करते वही हैं, हम कोशिश वही करने की करते हैं जो हमें लगता है कि पॉसिबल हो। हम कभी इम्पॉसिबल चीज़ें करने की कोशिश नहीं करते। हम नेट पर सर्च करते हैं कि अपने हेयर फॉल को कैसे कंट्रोल करें। हम नहीं सर्च करते कि हम 150 साल कैसे जी सकते हैं, क्योंकि हमें पता है वो नामुमकिन है। पर इस पूरे मूवमेंट ने, इस पिछले समय ने हमें ये दिखाया है कि हाँ, कुछ कोशिश की जा सकती है, कुछ नतीजा निकल सकता है। आप पीछे मुड़ के देखें तो हमारी फिल्में जैसे ब्यूरोक्रेसी को, पॉलिटिशियंस को, सिस्टम को।
एक बार असीम, आप हमारे गेस्ट को यहाँ बताइए कि आपने कौन सी जो कार्टून बनाया था और उसके चलते आपके साथ क्या बीती?
मेरा मतलब है कि मैं ये बताना चाह रहा था कि पूरा का पूरा सिस्टम हमने हमेशा नेगेटिव शेड में ही देखा है। चाहे वो हमारी कहानियाँ हो, चाहे हमारी फिल्में हो, हम हमेशा वैसी ही बातें करते रहे हैं, हमेशा उसे नेगेटिव शेड में ही देखते रहे हैं। मैंने बस वही बात जो हम सब हमेशा बोला करते थे, हम अपने घरों में बात करते थे, आपस में बात करते थे, नेट पर लिख रहे थे, उसे ही कार्टून्स में दिखाने की कोशिश की थी। वो उसके अलावा कुछ नहीं था। मतलब वो एक सीधी सीधी सच्चाई थी जो हम आपस में बात करते थे। बहुत प्रैक्टिकल सी चीज़ थी, बहुत इमेजिनेशन नहीं था, बहुत बड़ा सटायर नहीं था। वो बहुत आम सी बातें थी जो हम यूँ बोलते थे और मैंने उन्हें कार्टून में दिखा दी थी।
तो जब ये आपके साथ ये बीती तो आपके परिवार ने इसके बारे आपको क्या कहा? उन्होंने क्या कहा कि ये काम बंद कर दो, या ठीक है जो कर रहे हो ये ठीक है?
ये मेरा डिसीजन था कि मैं ये कर रहा था, क्योंकि मुझे लगता था कि मैं ऐसे कार्टूनिस्ट क्या कंट्रीब्यूट कर सकता हूँ अपनी आर्ट के थ्रू, मुझे वो करना चाहिए और मैं वो कर रहा था। इसके बाद और मेरे लिए यही मैटर करता है कि मैं क्या चाहता हूँ, और ज़्यादातर लोगों ने इसके बाद फिर मेरा साथ दिया, तो उससे वो हिम्मत और बढ़ी और मुझे लगा कि जो मैं कर रहा हूँ वो ठीक है और आगे मुझे इसी लड़ाई को और बढ़ाना चाहिए, हो सके तो कार्टून से आगे ले जाना चाहिए।
तो आपने आपकी जो एक्सपीरियंस जो आपके साथ हुआ उससे क्या सीखा, आपने क्या लेसन लिया?
मतलब मैंने ये सीखा है कि हम सबके हाथ में कुछ ना कुछ होता है, हम लड़ाई में कोई ना कोई भूमिका निभा सकते हैं, पर हम समझ नहीं पाते कि वो रोल क्या होगा, और ज़्यादातर ये सोच के हम उस लड़ाई से दूर होते हैं। हम ये समझ नहीं पाते कि यहाँ हम कुछ कर पाएंगे या नहीं, और हम घर में बैठे होते हैं, जबकि हम जो भी कर रहे होते हैं, जैसे भी कर रहे होते हैं, जो भी हमारे टैलेंट्स होते हैं, जहाँ भी हम होते हैं, वहाँ से कुछ ना कुछ करने को ज़रूर होता है, बशर्ते हम ये सोचना चाहें। मतलब मैं ये सोचता हूँ कि एक्टिविज़म का मतलब ना तो आंदोलन करना है, ना अनशन करना है, ना जेल जाना ही है। एक्टिविज़म का मतलब यही तो है कि कभी हम अपने लिए लड़ने के बजाय किसी और के लिए लड़ने की कोशिश करें, या एक समस्या से एक इशू पे कंसंट्रेट करें, एक लार्जर इशू की तरफ बढ़ें, और ये समझें कि हमें जो प्रॉब्लम हुई है वो एक किस लार्जर इशू की वजह से है, उसका बड़ा रीज़न क्या है, और उस पर जब हम काम करना शुरू करते हैं हम एक्टिविस्ट हो जाते हैं। जब हम किसी अंधे को रोड पार कराते हैं हम एक्टिविस्ट हो जाते हैं। तो थोड़ा सा भी अगर हम अपनी बाउंड्रीज के बाहर जाके सोचना शुरू करें और कंट्रीब्यूट करना शुरू करें तो लोग सपोर्ट करते हैं और चीज़ें वर्क करती हैं कई बार।
Shahzad, he said something very fundamental. Asim said something very fundamental. He said the idea of, first of all, he said that each one of us can be involved in some kind of a struggle or activism. That the challenge is to discover what's the fit of the activism that I need to be part of. More importantly, he said that the true nature of an activist is one when he picks up a particular issue, which really doesn't have to do just with him, but with something much larger. So he fights for someone else, not for himself alone.
True.
Right? Now, in your experience, because for 2 years you've been deeply embedded, both in street protest and now in an inchoate entry into electoral politics. So 2 things I want to ask you. Has it been your experience that a lot of people enter the idea of an activist outburst in a very faddish manner? It's a vogue, you go through the vogue and you get out the other door and you get on with your life. Has that been your experience with a lot of the people you saw who came to be part of it? Secondly, taking off on something Harsh said earlier, he pointed out 2 things that I always point out when people ask me about the challenge of India. I always say that for me, the two greatest challenges facing India are inequality and injustice. I think at the heart of the Indian narrative, that's the 2 things you need to address. And I've always felt, and if I'm wrong, you must correct me, I've always felt that corruption is actually a symptom of both inequality and injustice. When you have the kind of endemic injustice and inequality that you have in India, and I mean including injustice again and again because a lot of the work that Tehelka does on a weekly basis brings out cases of this across the board. I'm saying if you have that scale of injustice and inequality, then corruption almost becomes inevitable. So the beast in the room really are these 2, inequality and injustice. But I know a lot of the Anna Hazare movement was based on the idea of combating corruption, right? So I just want you to address both these things. One, what is the character and quality of the activists you've encountered in the last 2 years? And second, has your own idea of the centrality of corruption in the Indian narrative graduated, changed, or it hasn't?
What you've said, you've mentioned activism and what it's all about. And as Asim said, it's just working, it's transcending yourself and doing something for someone else or going beyond yourself. Then you mentioned the fact that why inequity or injustice is really the heart of the issue, and these are the real core problems. And then you mentioned Anna Hazare and why people came and not, I think that was what you were trying to say. I think this is all connected.
First of all, just give this audience an idea of the quality of the activist who came up, who arrived at your door, willing to support the movement, and whether that was an activist who was just a kind of a wayfarer, or were these guys serious and stayed with you?
I would say that, Tarun, but I would implore and request you that don't pit a kind of an activist against another. Don't pit a kind of a movement against another.
I'm not doing that.
Don't pit,
I'm trying to understand.
Don't pit Anna Hazare movement against Ekta Parishads. Don't pit a middle class against the lower classes.
No,
don't pit the farmers against the professionals.
No, we're
Please
not trying
don't
to
do
that.
Activism is a broad-based thing. I'm
trying to actually get your experience of the activist who came to you.
As a news journalist, the kind of panel I chose and the topic I chose for my show, day after day, and the choice of panelists I got, and the way I nuanced my question showed my activism. As the media kind of a campaigner, manager of Anna Hazare's movement, the way I worked in political communication showed my activism. As part of Arvind Kejriwal's party, the message I give and the areas I go to also show my activism. So you do activism, all of you could be undercover activists, all of you here. You know, you could be working as a doctor, as a pharmacist, as a professional, as an entrepreneur, and all of you could be activists. So to pit one against the other and make one sound less serious than the other is unfair. People do what they can, wherever they can, whenever they can. So I think that has to be, when you transcend yourself and you're moved by the idea of injustice and you feel you must fight it any which way, it's a welcome thing. So I'm for that, essentially.
No, we are all for the activism. I was trying to understand from you, for myself and for the audience here, what was the quality of the activists who came and joined your movement? Did many of them stay on? Did many leave? How many were really serious about this great change that we were all pursuing?
There were all kinds. There were the Dabbawalas from Mumbai. There were many farmers from Mewat. There were just regular professionals. There were housewives and old women who've never stepped out of their houses. And I'm noticing that I've been in it for 2 years. And I've actually not, I work pro bono. I don't get paid to say this, as opposed to when I was an anchor. I've seen the quality of the activist or / volunteer supporter part of the movement also change. The same person probably came because of the Vande Mataram Nara or the Inqilab Nara, or because he or she is affected by corruption. But now I see a kind of a growth, an enhancement in understanding of political issues. The cadres getting kind of mobilized to engage more, to understand more. And that is growth. So that is a maturing of the same regular common person who had no idea of activism, who lived for himself or herself, to grow beyond himself and to learn new things about politics and engage better. So I'm seeing that maturing process happening around me, within myself too, because I'm just an ordinary volunteer for my party, which has yet to win any elections so far. So I think it's very unfair. Also, a lot of spin doctoring is done, and I can say that right now here, because all of you understand business. You mentioned media earlier and movements, and I think these are perhaps the only two areas I know something about. When you look at, when you say there are many more channels now, it does not necessarily mean plurality of ideas being expressed. Because when you look at the equity structures and you see who represents them and what is the purpose, you realize it's actually the same old vested interest, the ruling elite versus the masses. So it's not really that different kinds of opinions are being talked about, but a central kind of an idea which caters to pretty much the ruling majority. And when I say that, I don't mean a party, but I'm talking about this whole big club, you know, cozy club of parties, bureaucrats, top media persons too, and media owners. Today we have people who have coal mines, newspapers and TV channels, and they want to get into broadband. So this is if you see the equity structures and who owns media, you realize it's a little club that works. And one is just exposing that more and more. Now, simply because middle classes came, and that is also according to you, and I don't totally buy it, and others were not there, there's not enough ground to either mock the movement or be dismissive of it. I think it's important